Hello, I'm Jerry Hill. I'm a native of Glade Spring, Virginia, retired school administrator, alumni of Emory and Henry College. And after about 40 years, I've returned to the area. And I love working with inclusion, equity, diversity, and justice across all aspects of life. The first panelist will be the Reverend Barbara Doyle. And the quote is, "Never succumb to the temptation of bitterness." Never succumb to the temptation of bitterness. We'll ask Barbara Doyle to introduce herself, and then I will ask the questions.
Hello, my name is Barbara Doyle. I'm the pastor at Shady Grove United Methodist Church in Abingdon, Virginia, and Meadowview United Methodist Church in Meadowview, Virginia.
Okay, and the questions to consider that quote, "Never succumb to the temptation of bitterness." What role, if any, does bitterness play in our current country's political dilemma? How likely is it that as a nation we have already succumbed to bitterness? What evidence of this do you see or do you not see, Reverend Doyle?
The evidence is evident from last Wednesday when there was a turmoil in the nation's capital. People have become so bitter that they want to tear down democracy and they want to install their own their own brand of democracy and live by it. And on Thursday night, we had a guest speaker for our MLK celebration, Ruby Sells, and she said, "Hurt is so deep, and evil knows no boundaries, and hatred knows no boundaries." And I want to include bitterness in there as well. Bitterness it sets traps for us. It's make us think negative thoughts, and we fall into those traps and we become bitter. And the benefit of that, there's no benefit to being bitter, but those that are bitter have these big chips on their shoulders, and they think they've been cheated, and above all else, they think that everybody's against them. So yes, people, the entire consortium of the world has become bitter from A to Z. Even pastors to some extent have become bitter. So yes, to the answer to all the questions is yes.
And I think we're
at 3 minutes.
Oh no, you have some time left. I think if not, we'll see if there's any comment or question from another panelist about bitterness. If not, we will look for Carly if there are any questions in the chat.
No questions so far.
Okay, I think now we go to Dr. Hollowell.
Okay, next we have Reverend David Graybeal. Reverend Graybeal, you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. It's good to be a part of this panel today. I'm originally from Marion, Virginia, and I'm also an alum of the college from 1995. So yeah, it's good to be with y'all.
Great. So the quote we have is, "We need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice. Not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity." Your questions are, what have you seen money affect? How have you seen money affect the American people? How has justice been on the back burner and money to the front? What evidence of love for humanity have you witnessed in 2020?
I'm glad I got an easy one there. Yeah, so I'm struck by, these were words that he delivered at a fraternity celebration, the 50th anniversary of the oldest Black fraternity in America, Alpha Phi Alpha, of which he was a brother, and he was there to receive an award that night. And what strikes me is we still need leaders like that. Even though he was addressing Black leadership, I think we need white and Black and all kinds of leaders like that, who are more in love with humanity than with publicity, than with their Twitter feed or how many followers they have, or that we need to have folks who are in love with those that they're seeking to lead. And I mean, there's lots of examples of where we see the love for money over justice in our world. I just think about our church, though, and in myself. Where do I see that? I'm mindful of the 28 white Methodist ministers from Mississippi that one of my professors when I was there, Joe Rife, wrote a book about some years ago, who many of whom left the area or left ministry because they took stands for justice. Wow. And I'm just mindful that every time that I'm tempted to hold my tongue, instead of standing up or speaking out about a particular justice issue in the church or in the world, out of fear that, of the money that might walk out the door if I were to do that, then I have to stop and ask myself the question, what kind of leader am I being? Am I more in love, more with money and the comfort that might bring than I am with justice, despite whatever discomfort that may bring? So I as with a lot of MLK's words, it forces me into introspection and to look at my own heart and life. Where I see love, though, expressed, I see it here in this panel and some of my colleagues that have spoken up for taking health measures in the midst of a pandemic, who have spoken out against some of the racism and white supremacy that we've seen. So I see that taking place, and I am encouraged by that.
Great. Thank you, Reverend Graybeal. Any colleagues have anything to add to that? Anyone?
I
Carly,
do.
okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
This is Jacqueline Davis-Gines, and I do appreciate what my colleague said about being a prophetic speaker, speaking out even when it's not popular, even when it may not be popular in our congregations. It is still our duty and our call to still speak justice and whatever God is putting on our hearts in that moment, despite the consequences of that. So I really do appreciate you making that point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. Anyone else?
I'd like to say that I think it's very important that when you have a celebrity status or you're in a position of influence and power, that it's important to really join in the fight against injustice. And I love the way how some of the celebrities stepped up this past summer to join in the protest. I think when you're blessed with celebrity and wealth, it is important to use it for righteous causes.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well said.
Carly, any questions?
No questions in the chat yet. Oh, I'm sorry. One question did pop up. Okay. Why do leaders often host? That's a Sharon Bowers question. I'm not sure exactly what you're trying to say, Sharon.
I was asking, why do leaders often choose the money track?
Oh, choose the money track. Gotcha.
That's a great question. And maybe it's idolatry. I mean, if we want to name it, it's this safety and security and comfort that maybe we're not called to find in money ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Reverend Bowers?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask Reverend Danny Belcher if he would introduce himself, and then we will share the quote and the questions. Okay. Well, maybe Reverend Belcher's not with us. If he shows up, we'll ask him a little bit later. So we'll move on to the next clergy.
Okay, the next person I have is Reverend Annette Warren. And we'll ask that you'll introduce yourself, and then I will read the quote and the questions.
Yes, good evening, good evening. I am the pastor of the Cedar Bluff United Methodist Church in Cedar Bluff, Virginia, and the Clearview United Methodist Church at Doyle, Virginia. I'm just glad to be here.
Okay, and the quote for Reverend Warren is, "A man can't ride your back unless it's bent." Have you witnessed or experienced the weight of oppression upon your back and the backs of others? How difficult is it to stand straight in today's environment? Historically, slavery has caused certain people to exist with a bent back. What will it take to stop letting others ride one's back?
I think one thing that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, that a man can't ride your back unless it's bent. So you think about that for a minute. What he was saying is that anyone can take advantage of you and keep you down if you let them. Of course, there were much more meaning wrapped up in those 9 words when he spoke it. But the baseline was that the heart of it is he was encouraging Black people to become supporters for themselves and peacefully resent segregation and intolerance built upon white lawmakers. And sadly, a good portion of the generation of the general population. So who wants to preserve this separation of Blacks and white at any cost? So I take these words to heart. Do they have the same meaning for me as they did for the people whom he was speaking back in the mid-60s? I think so. Even during the upset of the civil rights struggles, I was very young, but still today, we're still dealing with some of the same issues as our forefathers dealt with in the day. To me, these words mean that I cannot be defeated. We cannot be defeated. We don't have to allow it to happen. If we don't invite failure, we have a good shot of succeeding. If we make ourselves into a doormat, then chances are we're going to get stepped on. And I think as we think about here is that someone can't have power over you if you're standing tall. And I think today, we as people of color and people of God's children, we must stand tall, and we must stand tall knowing that we have a role to play. And the role to play is, as the commandment says, love God. Love God with all our heart, all our mind, and all our soul, but also love our neighbors. And if we can just remember and focus on the love of God, then I think that we will succeed in what Dr. King has spoken many years ago. Yes, I've seen so many different times that people have taken advantage of people of color and taken advantage of people in general. Unfortunately, that's just something that continues to happen in today's time. And as a woman of God, it's one of those things that you have to be very prayerful and very committed to the things that are right and speak when we see something that's not right. Stand our ground, stand firm. And that may mean you have to stand alone. But we always know we're not alone because Christ is with us.
All right, thank you, Reverend Warren. Are there any comments or questions from any of the panelists? Hearing none. Carly, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes. How do people straighten up under today's oppression?
I think one reason we straighten up is it's not different. It's the choice that we make. We are a people of choice. We make the choice to do what's right. We make the choice to do what's wrong. And even making the choice to do what's right, sometimes people still will oppress us in a situation. But I think one of the most important things as a believer is that we have to remember that this battle is not all ours. And God left us with the Holy Spirit, and we operate in God's Spirit. And we must sometimes we don't have, every battle is not ours. Every battle that we face is not always ours, but we have to take heed into those things that are very important, that are dear to our hearts, and we have to speak on them. But I think we are forgetting to speak in love, and I think if we can speak in love and respect and speak in respect for one another. That makes our struggles a little bit easier. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to have any, because we know that we are. But we're only accountable for ourselves. And I think the choices that we make and the words that we use and the lack of respect for one another sometimes causes us back to be bent when it's not necessarily all our fault, but sometimes it can be our fault because the words that we use. We need to watch our words.
Okay, Dr. Holloway.
I'm going to interrupt. I understand that that Reverend Belcher has joined us, and so we'll go back to Reverend Belcher and we will read that quote and after he introduces himself, and then I'll ask a couple of questions and we'll keep moving along, please. And we're trying to go quickly, but if you have a question, we want you to ask that question and definitely share it with us. And we want our panelists to have time to answer it. I don't want to make everybody feel like you can't say anything because we're hurry, but we do want to be mindful of time. Reverend Belcher, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, praise the Lord. My name is Danny Belcher. I'm pastor up at Fairview Baptist Church in Glade Springs, Virginia. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm sorry about not being on, but something happened on my iPad that I had to finally get it together, but we're here now.
Okay, we're glad to have you. The quote that Reverend Belcher that we're asking you to respond to is simply, we must learn to live together as brothers, and I would add sisters, or perish together as fools. We must learn to live together as brothers, and I add sisters, or perish together as fools. The questions are kind of a summary of what do you think it has been, why do you think it's been so difficult for people from other races, ethnicities, gender identifications to live together in peace? And are people willing to perish as opposed to live in harmony? And if so, why do you think that, Reverend Belcher?
Well, one of the first things that I realized is that without a doubt, most people that I have encountered does not feel good about talking about subjects such as racism and equality and all of that, because they feel like it's going to either lead to some type of argument or fussing. So people most generally would rather avoid talking about it rather than come together and talk about it so that we could come to equal agreement on things that we could have better lives with one another. I don't think that they have in mind that we should perish, but they rather avoid confrontation, I guess you would say, more than anything else. So if I can get around it, then I'll try to, even often in our pulpits and things like that, oftentimes we will avoid certain subjects for, you might say, fear of losing part of our congregation or causing confusion in the church and all that. Not that it's good, because, Martin Luther King himself said the ultimate measure, and I'll put it this way, the ultimate measure of a man or a woman is not where he stands in moments of comfort or convenience, but where he or she stands at times of challenge and controversy. The true neighbor will risk his position, prestige, and even his life for the welfare of others. So there are some times that we must speak up and speak out about the things that is wrong in life when we see it, even if it's going to cause someone to feel uncomfortable.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any probing comments from the panelists? If there are no probing comments from our panelists, do we have a question? I see we have several questions from our audience. Would Carly, would you read one of those and give Dr. Reverend Belcher an opportunity to respond?
Yes. In America, it seems that there is a continuous growth in the white evangelical mindset, which opposes many movements such as Black Lives Matter. What advice would you give young progressive Christians advocating for Jesus's teachings and his work for marginalized groups?
Reverend Belcher, you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself again, sir.
I'm sorry. Well, without a doubt, Martin Luther King said it best, that we must speak out and speak out about things, but we should also advocate peace and doing it. It does, because we are now living in a day and time when we have such diversities, even within families. There is no, when you look around, we have so many different ethnic people, as far as people of color, black, white, or whatever. So therefore, we have, as a young person coming up in our day, in this day and time, and they must just be able to stand up for equality, no matter what comes their way, and just speak it in love and in truth. Because, we're going to look back, the scripture said, every kingdom divided against itself, will really perish. So we don't want to divide the kingdom. We don't want to divide the nation. We have to begin to learn how to live one another. As oftentimes we say in church, sometimes we just have to simply agree to disagree.
Okay, well, we thank you for that. If you'll just keep your questions coming, we maybe have time at the end to kind of go over a couple of them and lift them up. But Jerry? No, John.
Okay. Next we have Reverend Dr. Robert Kariuki. Would you please tell us who you are?
Thank you, the panelists and all those who are in this Zoom. My name is, as you have heard, Robert Kariuki, native of Kenya. I moved in this great nation over 20 years ago. And I am currently ministering at John Wesley United Methodist Church and Trinity United Methodist Church. And I am in a group or a preaching rotation in Bristol called HAP, and I preach in other churches, or we rotate with other ministers in this Bristol HAP. Otherwise, I'm blessed to be here, and I'm a child of God because I'm born again. Thank you.
Amen. Reverend Kariuki, a question we have for you is, or the quote is, "The time is always right to do what is right." And the questions are, how do you discern when the time is right? What makes it difficult for people to simply do the right thing?
Great, thank you very much. Like the quote, it is, the time is always right to do what is right. It is never too late to stand or to do something. You start from where you are with what you have. I know there, we live in a world where there is a lot of procrastinations, and I have lived in that kind of world, but until I think I met Jesus. I don't know why, but when I became a Christian, that is when procrastination being vanished, which is like, I used to delay things. I used to postpone things, but Christ actually, I think, quickened me, and the Spirit of the Lord quickened me. And I believe that, procrastination is the opposite of realizing that we are in such a time as this so that we can impact the kingdom of God. I think this quote from Reverend Dr. King is a reminder to all of us that there is no tomorrow, and tomorrow never comes. Today is the day, and this is the moment. Actually, even the Paul saying that to the church of Corinthians. If you read chapter 6, verses 2, says, "In the time of your favor I helped you, and in the days of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation." This is the time. So with all these movement we hear today, I think it is the people who are realizing it is the time to seize the moment. When Dr. King and the movement of civil rights was actually at its climax here in the United States, in Africa, starting with Kenya and all the East African country, there was also a movement of independence. And if you look at the history of Africa, most of the countries actually became independent around that time from the British and other colonizers. So it's like God, as you know, it's like there is a moment God awakens his people and appoint men and women to stand for the truth. And it is something which happened not only at one place, but around the world. So how do you know when the time is right to do what is right? I think it is, first of all, you have to know who you are. You have to realize who you are. Your purpose in this world, and know the season, because God actually operates in seasons. And we have to realize what season you are in so that you will not be left behind. I was preaching today and I reminded my congregation about that, and I've been receiving a lot of comments from my congregation, because they gone for the connection we see now, because this is the moment when we need to put our differences, start from where you are and what you have. So why make it difficult for people to do what is right? Why? I think it's because we do not want to practice self-discipline. We just want to sit in a kosher place, hiding ourselves behind computers and stuff like that, and think that we are impacting the world. No. We have to get in front of line, self-discipline. We are not faithful to one another, actually to one another and even to our own self, because we have to look at ourselves. We do not want to accept responsibility. We do not want to keep our word. So those are the things which makes people, or makes us, make it difficult for us to do what is right. I know it's the beginning of the year. A lot of us have made resolutions, and they tell us it's only like 8% who keep their resolution which they made at the beginning of the year. God always gives us a season, and I believe even in injustice and equality and whatever is happening around the world today, we have to realize that we have to be self-disciplined and say, I'm gonna stand and I want to be counted.
Great.
Be self-disciplined. Start with us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Reverend Dr. Kariuki. I think that in the because we have a number of panelists that are yet to go, we're going to hold the extra questions perhaps until the end. Is that okay with everyone?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
And just as a reminder, preachers, we're gonna shorten it so that everybody can have a preach. All right.
Amen.
Thanks a million. Thanks a million. Okay, so now we're going to ask Reverend Dwayne Mabry if he will introduce himself and then, or theirself, and then we will read the quote.
Hello, I'm Dwayne Mabry, pastor at the First Baptist Church in Chilhowie, Virginia. I'm originally from Lebanon, Virginia, which is over in Russell County, over the mountain. And so I've been in this area for quite a long time, but we're just glad to be here today.
Thank you so much, Reverend Mabry. The quote is, "Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war." Again, those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. The questions for you, Reverend Mabry, are a combination of: why do we insist on conflict over peace? How does power play out in how we organize our day-to-day lives? And how and why should we push the agenda of peace over war?
Okay, I think well, I looked at that question, I was like, wow, that's a kind of a tough question, but I think the easiest answer to why we choose conflict over peace is because it's just more comfortable to us. It's more natural to us just to choose the quick answer, which often we think might mean to engage conflict rather than trying to build bridges with one another. I think that's been true from Cain and Abel. When Cain decided to kill his brother Abel, I think we've chosen those answers of conflict rather than peace. But the problem with that is that even though violence may be the quick and the more immediate answer, gets us immediate results, eventually that all comes back on us. And that universal principle comes to mind that says, what a person sows, that will he also reap. And whenever we sow violence into the world, that eventually comes back to us. And so I think the answer there is that we need to learn to focus and be committed to the idea that we're all connected. We're all are one. And when we seek to engage violence, that's usually when we're thinking that the other person or another group is not connected to us. And we identify that person or group as being other. And when we identify that person or group as being other, then we decide, well, I don't have to engage in trying to work things out with them because I can do something harmful to them and it won't come back to me. And so, but if we realize that we're all connected, then I think we will come to the understanding that, yes, we need to work and try to bring peace rather than engage in conflict and violence. And so there's a verse in the Bible that says the thief, those who have robbed or those who are thieves should steal no longer. And I think about that topic a lot of times and I say, well, when that happens, the thief feels like they've been violated because something they thought they had the right to robbing others, but now they don't have that anymore. They've lost something. And so a lot of times people continue to do that which is wrong because it continues to be profitable to them. And so that's an aspect to it as well.
Thank you, Reverend Mabry. And let me apologize. I had my cheat sheet over here and I jumped through when we started losing time. I went through a whole section. So we're going to go back to the right one. And that's supposed to be my good friend, Reverend Brenda Carroll. So we'll go back, get back on the schedule. And sorry for any panic that I caused anybody. Okay. So Brenda Carroll, Reverend Brenda Carroll, would you introduce yourself and then we'll see your quote and ask a couple of questions. Thank you, Reverend Mabry.
Brenda Carroll, and I'm retired clergy living in Knoxville. Glad to get both of us Russell County people lined up here, Reverend Mabry. That's where I grew up too. That's all that there is about me.
Okay. Then I'll ask you the question. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. So the questions are, in what ways are we tied to one another? What are the results of acting as if our lives are not interconnected? And how does division keep us all living beneath our privilege?
Well, the reality is we are connected, but we live as though we're not much of the time. There's a sense in which so much of 2020 has caused what is invisible a lot of the times about the way we behave to become very visible. Our selfishness, our self-centeredness, our greed, our propensity to compete and want to put others down to lift ourselves up. All of this has become very visible. I was reading, when I got this, I went back to a Diana Butler Bass article in which she talked about hearing interviews during the Christmas season with people who were traveling. And she said one woman told a reporter, "I take precautions. If I get it, I really don't think I'll die." And she said, "I yelled at the TV. That's not the point. The point is you might spread COVID and kill someone else. You aren't the point. Your neighbor is the point." And she says, "What one does echoes in 1,000 other lives." We are interconnected. And the third guiding pillar of Dr. King's life and work, he had 3 guiding pillars. And the third one was the commitment to nonviolence and appreciation for our ultimate interdependence. Yet, on NPR, John Paul Lederer said, "What we have seen is the disappearance of our basic social contract, the way we have always been expected to be with each other, or the best of humanity. We've lost that basic social contract, so that dehumanization replaces respect, blame supplants responsibility, and violence is justified over dialogue." And a question I would ask is it possible to reverse these dynamics? I feel like Dr. King gave his life rather than abandon the work to reverse those propensities, that he gave his life to lift up and show us the way to be interconnected in this very human way. He gave his life to reverse, to transform, and to follow Jesus into the beloved community. In his "I Have a Dream" speech, he noted that across the racial divide between Black and white, our freedoms, their freedom, our freedom, our freedom, their freedom, is intrinsically bound with each other. One will never be free until all are free. We are interconnected, and we cannot be our whole and best self until that is lived out. In that same article by Diana Butler Bass, she was remembering 60 years ago when the front page of the Saturday Evening Post was the great Norman Rockwell painting or picture painting that was just lots of people in the background, and on it appeared the words, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Where have we heard that? She actually listed a version of that from every major religion in the world. But for us as Christians, we've heard it since we were children in Sunday school. Is that a guiding pillar for us that can begin to reverse some of the disconnect that we pretend exists and that we live into? Can that help us bring out our better angels? She says, "We are one, and all human beings have mutual responsibility to care for each other and for our planet." And I love the way she ended her article. She said, "We need to teach it, preach it, sing it, shout it, pray it, practice it, and live it." And I would say amen to that.
Gary, I think you're next.
All right, next we have Reverend Cross, if you would introduce yourself. Reverend Walter Cross. I guess if he's not here, we'll go ahead to Dr. Holly.
Okay, we have Reverend Jodi Ihfe. Would you please tell us about yourself?
Hi, I am currently serving as a senior pastor of First United Methodist Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. And I'm also an Emory and Henry alum, class of 2005. And I'm really glad to be here.
Great. We're glad to have you here, Reverend Ihfe. So your quote is, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." The questions are, what are some examples of ignorance diminishing the capacity of American citizens? Why does ignorance, especially in relation to race, persist? What are some things in your life that you have witnessed that could be categorized as blatantly ignorant or stupid?
Thanks. So I was unfamiliar with this quote, and since it was about ignorance, I thought I should do some research. And I learned that this is a quote from a sermon called Love in Action, and it's based on the scripture, "Then Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.'" And it's particularly tied into that second part of the scripture, "They know not what they do." And that was really significant to me, because I think mostly about the forgiveness part of that passage and pay less attention to the ignorance part. But ultimately, King gets to the point that ignorance is deadly. It's part of what killed Jesus. So with that in mind, I think it adds a lot of weight. But I would say examples are very obvious. Examples of ignorance in our society. I mean, we see it on the news. We see it in our personal lives with our families and neighbors. We see it all over social media. And we know that ignorance stunts our growth and it keeps us from progressing as people and from learning more things. But it can also be physically dangerous. And I think that's very obvious in the way we as Americans have dealt with the COVID-19 crisis and how people are willfully ignorant of science. But also we see it in things that happen like the insurrection in the Capitol and all throughout the summer of misguided, violent actions based on false information, where people are refusing to understand what's actually going on and not doing any kind of background information. They just say whatever they want to say. And I think it persists because ignorance is easier. It's just easier to not learn the truth, or to not do the research, or to not ask hard questions, and to assume that we already know everything we need to know. And in particular, in this sermon from Dr. King, he calls out the church, and he says that the church has talked as though ignorance were a virtue and intelligence a crime. And I've experienced that from other traditions and from individual Christians who seem to lift up anti-intellectualism as a virtue, and that asking questions and learning things are somehow against God. But also I think it persists because, especially in relation to race, because we have this false history that we've learned in America of who America is and how we got to where we are and when it started and who started it and who the actual heroes are. And we just live into that ignorance. And it's a lot more palatable and a lot more comfortable for people who look like me and those who are living into their white privilege. And so ignorance lets me maintain that power and that comfort. And the third part of that question, the third question is about how things I've witnessed in my life. And it's really easy to point the finger at somebody else and say, oh, I see lots of stupid people over there. But what I've realized is that I have been ignorant of lots of things in my own life. And so I've spent, especially this past year, examining my own ignorance, and examining my own stupidity and the things that I don't know yet. And especially as it relates to systemic racism and American history. And I spent a lot of time studying those things and trying to get a more accurate perspective on the things that have happened and the things that are happening. So I will end my little part with this other quote from the same sermon from Dr. King, where he says, we as church leaders, as Christian leaders, we have a mandate both to conquer sin and to conquer ignorance.
Thank you, Reverend Ihfe. Reverend Bowers?
Yes, I think Reverend Cross may have joined us back. He was having trouble us hearing him. If you can hear me now, Reverend Cross? Okay.
Technical difficulties.
Now we can hear you, so if we'll go back and give Carly a minute to get that up, and then Jerry, you can finish with Reverend Cross.
Hey, Reverend Cross, you would introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Walter Old Rugged Cross, and I am blessed of the Lord to serve lovely Lonsdale and magnificent Martin, located in the heart of Lonsdale, Tennessee, close to Knoxville, a little suburb outside of Lonsdale. And I'm so honored to be here with you all.
Great, thank you, Reverend Cross. The quote is, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The questions are, how can we offer more light than dark? What are some of the challenges with this statement? How do we replace hate with love in our everyday lives?
Well, in the spirit of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, when he put this forth across the Dexter pulpit in Alabama, he had faced a terrific night of torture when a man called and threatened his family and his own life. And it was the midnight cry of the soul for him. Lord, shall I protect my family or give me the strength to go on? As we know, he got the strength to go on. And he got to the pulpit that morning and he began to wrap himself in Matthew 5, love your enemies. And he went on to tell us where to get the strength to do this. He broke it down very, very clearly. And he said that love is the tool of the creative spirit of God for redemption. So he encouraged us to apply love even in situations that are dark and hateful, because darkness and hate is self-perpetuating. It continues, it begets its own kind. Darkness is being totally uninformed, but moving ahead anyway. And hatred is the denial to believe that the other person in your purview is the created spirit of God. In other words, he said that love changes us. Love changes me. I want to give an example of love changing me. Many years ago, well, about 5 years ago, I was preaching, I was doing a children's sermon, and one of your colleagues, I won't call Dr. Sharon Bowers' name, but she was there on that day as a guest. And she told me during that worship experience, she said, Cross, why don't you write some of that down? Well, later on, see, she loved me enough to tell me the truth. Love changes me. Well, later on, she called me sometime later and she said, if you don't write it down, I'm going to ask your wife's permission to come over and kick your butt. so you can write it down. Now, I didn't accept that as violence. That was a challenge where I came from. That was motivation because I couldn't stand another good butt kicking. Life had given me enough. And now I am an author because my colleague, my friend, my dear sister loved me enough to tell me the truth, and her love changed me. Love is redemptive. How am I doing on time? Love changes us, and we need to follow the spirit of Reverend King, who said, love your enemies, no matter what they do to you, what they say, how evil it sounds when that meanness drips off of their lips. Keep on loving people. It is an example of what Christ has done for us in the redemptive spirit. Is that helpful, y'all?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Reverend Cross. We really appreciate Reverend Old Rugged Cross.
Old Rugged.
I think now we're back to Reverend Bowers.
Yes, and I need to take a consensus from everyone. We're about at the time that I told you, we have many miles to go before we sleep. And so if you will indulge, if those of you who can stay on and don't have to go to other meetings, we will change our format and we will simply read the quote and ask you to comment rather than read any particular questions. So we'll read the quote and ask for comments from you, and we'll see if that can buy us a little bit of time. And I apologize for the time that it has taken us, but hasn't this been rich? Yes. Hasn't it been thought-provoking? Haven't we been able to just see God's best on parade? So we'll go really quickly. Those of you that can stay on, please stay on to the end, and we'll move as quickly as we can by not asking the questions, just reading the quote and asking the pastors to make the comment after they quickly introduce themselves. And so we should be able to wrap up in about 30 minutes. My best guess, that would be it. We'll shoot for that. We'll make that happen. So if somebody's in the middle of it, we'll cut you off. No, we'll try to do the best we can. Reverend Brenda Bell McAdams, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. And my name is Brenda Bell McAdams, and I am pastoring here in Greenville, Tennessee, in the Cherokee Circuit family. My churches are Mount Pisgah, River Hill, and Mount Carmel. I am a native of Chattanooga, Tennessee. My quote is, "The hottest place in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral in times of great moral conflict." I would like to begin by stating humbly, but fervently, that in the time of great moral conflict, like the one we're facing in America now, neutrality is nothing more than an illusion. A powerful and compelling illusion. I believe that people embrace that illusion of neutrality first out of fear that is either rational or irrational, out of ignorance, and that ignorance can be passed down or it can be preferred because if you know better, you do better, and out of blatant indifference. Neutrality is an illusion because those of us who choose to be neutral or silent become complicit in whatever oppression or harm that is taking place. For instance, those who abhorred slavery during that time, but who would not stand and speak up against slavery along with the abolitionists, were complicit in the slave trade and the behavior of slave owners. Those who would not stand against Jim Crow laws and behavior were complicit in the harm that those laws and behaviors did. Those of us today who try to claim neutrality in the face of the social unrest that we are seeing today are complicit in every discriminatory law, every discriminatory proposal and act of oppression that victimizes people of color, women, children, the elderly, and the poor. Even the church cannot claim a position of neutrality in time of moral conflict. For example, and this is my humble opinion, turning away from the needs of the LGBTQ community for full inclusion in the movement of Christianity, because I do see Christianity as a movement, a creative movement that is always open to the will and the mind of God. Denying even this community, I feel, makes us complicit to all of the discrimination and the violence that this community has had to put up with for such a long time. I want to close my comment with a remark that Martin Luther King made in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? He said, what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
Thank you so much, Reverend McAdams. Next, and we'll keep moving as quickly as we can. If you are able, those of you who are long-term pastors and you know how to shorten the sermon when you see them start moving in their seat or falling asleep, let's try to do that if we can. All right.
All right, next we have Reverend Don Hanshew. If you will introduce yourself, and then I will read the quote.
Sure, thanks, Jerry. My name is Don Hanshew. I am a sinner saved by grace that loves serving a church called Dublin United Methodist in Virginia. And I guess my biggest claim to fame connected to Emory and Henry is that I married the 1997 homecoming queen. And, she's probably regretted that her whole life, but hey, I'm loving it. So her name is Carol Bragg, for those who know.
Okay, and the quote is, shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than an absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will.
You know, that quote comes, context. It's so important. That quote comes from Martin Luther King's letter that he wrote when he was in the Birmingham jail on the edges of a newspaper. And the context of that is, remember the name Bull Connor, the police chief who was just extremely violent. And King and many others had descended down on Birmingham and said, you know, this is the most segregated city in the country. And they're trying to get a response, and they got a response. And a lot of different things were kind of unfolding. He was put in jail. And his letter that he wrote on the edge of this newspaper was in response to a couple bishops, a couple Presbyterian leaders and Baptist leaders. 9 of them in total had written a letter, and they had called it something that it really wasn't. The letter that they wrote was called an appeal or a call to unity. But the first paragraph and the last paragraph had this painful quote that echoes very sharply for all of us right now. In that letter, that first and last paragraph, it says, we are calling for an appeal for law and order and common sense. And anytime I hear people who are in power calling for law and order and common sense, it makes me back up and question what's really going on. And 3 points I want to make real fast. And this might help us out a little bit. Let me try this real fast. One is that if you dither and delay, that's deadly. And that's exactly what happens when people call to slow down or what's going on in this. You know, people who are misunderstanding, they're just wanting to dither and delay, and it's deadly for other people. The other issues that we face with that is that I have to learn as a straight white male to distrust my knee-jerk reaction around race and around issues of race and gender and human sexuality. Otherwise, I'm tempted to become a voice that doesn't really understand what's really happening, the cost of lives, of pain, and of persecution that's really unfolding in the situation. And then ultimately, I need to be careful about my misunderstanding, or I'm very guilty, or equally guilty as anyone else, of trying to white-splain my way out of something and trying to say, well, no, this is really how it is from my perspective, and that's incorrect. So I think what Martin Luther King was, in very dignified language, was trying to say something very sharp to leaders who were not wanting change because they recognized the impact that would have on them and the power structure that would change for them. So that's my 3 quick points. I appreciate and feel honored to be on the panel.
Thank you, Reverend Hanshew, and we're back to Dr. Holloway.
Okay, Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Davis Gines, or Gines, would you please tell us about yourself?
Hello, yes, Jacqueline Davis Gines. Thank you
Gines.
so much. I'm from Seneca, South Carolina, and I'm a 2020 alumni of Gammon Theological Seminary. So I feel a little weird with all these Emory and Henry folks, but I'm glad to be here. Thank y'all for inviting me anyway.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm a member of St. John United Methodist Church, and I'm in the 2021 commissioning class for the hosting conference. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll read the quote real quick. Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon. Indeed, it is a weapon unique in history, which cuts without wounding and enables the man who wields it.
All right. This quote comes from Dr. King's Nobel Prize lecture. And that lecture was titled The Quest for Peace and Justice. And King believed that nonviolence was the best method because he believed it was the only way to reestablish a broken community. King wasn't just looking for justice alone, but reconciliation, just as Christ reconciles us, so that we would all be reconciled to one another. So as I was reading this quote and thinking about the questions that were put before me, I had to go back and I had to look at what does nonviolence really mean? Because we've heard so many things about it that unless you understand the method, you will misunderstand King's purpose and the way he was moving. And there's 6 key elements or principles to the method that he is using. And this method comes directly from Gandhi's way of thinking and way of doing business. And it really impacted Dr. King. There were also some other folks, existentialism, that whole idea also impacted him. But Gandhi really had a lot to do with how he was looking at this. So when I was thinking about it, these 6 principles, I'm going to shorten them, but we're just going to look at it. You must resist evil without violence. Friendship and understanding versus humiliation. Confront evil itself, not the people committing evil. You must be willing to suffer because suffering is resistance. And no violence. No violence externally, no violence internally. No shooting, but love. And the final of the 6 principles is we must have a deep faith in the future because the universe always leans toward justice. So when you're looking at these key principles and a key way of looking at things, and then you begin to ask these questions, what would this have looked like if nonviolent? What would this whole thing at the Capitol have looked like if it had been truly a nonviolent protest? And understand this, the Freedom Forum does say violence, no matter the motive, is not the First Amendment protest that we hold dear. So, period. If there's the violence, no matter the motive, it's not the First Amendment protest. So we need to look at what would it have looked like. Number one, no guns would have showed up. The bomb wouldn't have even been in the car because that would have just gone against the nonviolence altogether. There would have been no breaking into the Capitol or fighting the police or any of these things because we wouldn't have been fighting against people. We wouldn't have been trying to intimidate the Congress or humiliate people. It would have been truly a protest where, okay, you might hurt me, but I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'm not going to touch anybody. And definitely no one will be killed on my watch. It just is. So when you're looking at it from the point of nonviolence, what happened at the Capitol wouldn't have happened. And also, how does nonviolence empower those who use it? I was looking at Freedom Forum this morning, and they had some Harvard research on there, and it says nonviolent resistors are 2 times more likely to make a real change. The truth is, violence shuts people's ears, and it shuts them down. It shuts down their hearts. And so if you're wanting to open people's hearts, open people's ears, nonviolence is the way to do it. You're 2 times more likely to get people to listen. Suffering has power. Gandhi showed that. He proved that to us. Jesus has shown that. Suffering has power, but you got to be willing to go through to get through. Love has power. Hallelujah. Thank God for salvation. Love has power. And so these things must be incorporated. Love over violence. We must be willing to love one another. When we're approaching that place of trying to have that conversation, love has to be at the very beginning and at the basis of what we're doing. And finally, what would we get out of this? If this had truly been nonviolent, how does it empower those? We would have gotten out of this the beloved community, because that's what nonviolence offers. It offers a community where people understand each other, a community where people can have a conversation about race or about gender or about whatever, and be able to come to a peaceful solution. Yes, that solution may sometimes be, I must agree to disagree, but we can come to a peaceful place. And finally, when we talk about the beloved community, which I pray for, which I look for, which I long for, and we're all looking for one day with Christ, is that we can dwell together in unity and in love. So I'm going to, I know I've gone, so I'm going to just stop right there, but understand that nonviolence is not just a movement, but a way of life. And Gandhi has shown us that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it's me because Reverend Mabry already has participated. We have Reverend Dr. Eric Reiger. If you will introduce yourself, I will read the quote.
Hi, I'm Eric Reiger. I am a Methodist clergy person that is appointed to an extension ministry of spiritual direction, life coaching, and health coaching through Sacred Quest.
Okay, and Dr. King's quote is, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Why does it appear that silence is preferred over justice?
All right. This quote, I did some research, seems to be a paraphrase of a more complex thought that Dr. King uttered during a sermon in Selma, Alabama on March 8, 1965, the day after Bloody Sunday. And I want to read it in its context, and because it's important to really understand what the paraphrase is saying. This is a direct quote from Dr. King. Deep down in our nonviolent creed is the conviction that there are some things so dear, some things so precious, some things so eternally true that they're worth dying for.
And if a man, and I add woman, happens to be 36 years old, as I happen to be, some great truth stands before the door of his or her life, some great opportunity to stand up for that which is right. A man, a woman might be afraid his or her home will get bombed, or she or he is afraid that they will lose their job, or he or she is afraid that they will get shot or beat down by state troopers, and he or she may go on to live until they're 80, but they're just as dead at 36 as they would have been at 80. The cessation of breathing in his or her life is merely the belated announcement of an earlier death of the spirit. They died. And here's the heart, the direct quote that this paraphrase is taken from. A man, a woman, I add, dies when they refuse to stand up for that which is right. A man, woman dies when they refuse to stand up for justice. A man, a woman dies when they refuse to take a stand for that which is true. Why does it appear that silence is preferred over justice? We are hardwired. It's our default position to survive and to be safe. And so many times we do choose psychological comfort, physical safety over things that matter more. And I really appreciate this full quote by Dr. King, because he says some things are so precious, some things so eternally true, some things so dear that they're worth dying for, and they're worth sacrificing for. And there are some things which transcend our need for safety and comfort. And that's the dream, that's the vision. And as I reflect on why people behave as they do, myself included, and I really appreciate Reverend Hanshew's remarks about being a single white straight male. I suffer from all those maladies too. But I've had so much to learn, and I have, as Jodi Ihfe, Reverend Ihfe said, I have struggled with extreme ignorance, and I'm learning and growing, and I'm so thankful for that. This morning, my wife, who's a pastor, preached a sermon, and we reaffirmed our baptismal vows. Do you renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness, reject the evil powers of this world, and repent of your sin? You accept the freedom and power which God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. And I thank Emory and Henry College. I thank Dr. Sharon Bowers for this opportunity, because when I said these vows this morning, they had such a new reverence for me as I have been wrestling and thinking about what we're doing here today. We're called to be God bearers, and I think what we're involved in is a continuing intervention in a sickness, and interventions are difficult. And I know that if there's not an intervention, nothing changes. Right. And nothing changes until it becomes real. Nothing changes until it becomes real. So the last part of my question, I'm trying to move quickly, is how do we get people to use their voice and agency to bring about change? And there's an acronym I like. It's VIM, vision, intention, and means. There has to be a compelling vision, and we have that. The beloved community that Jackie was talking about. We have the compelling vision, but we have to share it. Then intention, there has to be intention and commitment willing to sacrifice, and then the means. And I was thinking about means, and I asked a dear Black friend, he's a young man, he's in his 20s, and he said something that I was so glad he said to me. He said, Eric, we have to help people become comfortable with being uncomfortable. We have to help people become comfortable with being uncomfortable. So we have to do like I learned to do a long time ago when I was training counseling. We have to do what's called future pacing. We have to say, this is going to be a hard conversation, or this is going to be hard to hear. but I need you to prepare yourself. We need to be comfortable to deal with things that are uncomfortable. And I still think we need training. I haven't received any formal training in my clergy training on inclusivity, equity, and diversity. Never have. And I think we who are voices really need ongoing training. And of course, we have to be courageous. And I just so thank you to be a part of this today. And I want to close with a quote by Father Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest, who said that we must be willing to, as much like what Gandhi said, become the change in the world that we wish to see. And we must be willing to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Reiger. And now we'll go back to Dr. Holloway.
Okay, so here is the quest, real quick. We have, we're quickly approaching 4:30, and we have about 6 more panelists to get through. And I don't know if it's possible to ask the panelists to see if they can give us their comments in 2 minutes. If we can just try to be mindful of the time. We're trying to end by 4:30. And I do want to acknowledge and apologize to folks who we appreciate your time. So I just want to be mindful of this being a half an hour over our time that we projected. So with that, I'll move on to Reverend Melvin Johnson. Reverend Johnson, are you with us? Okay. Reverend Bowers?
Yes, we'll have Reverend Jeni Lee. Would you introduce yourself and then we'll...
Yes, my name is Jeni Lee. I'm the pastor at Savannah United Methodist Church in Ottawa, Tennessee. I'm the mother of an 8 and almost 14-year-old 2 boys. I'm wife to Dr. Joe Boshiers, who is in the process to become an ordained elder within the United Methodist Church. And I'm grateful for the invitation to be with you.
Okay, let's have a quote, please. The quote is, "He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." Reverend Lee, could you comment to that, please?
Yes, and I'll try and reduce. We've had lots of lively conversation about this quote this week at our house, and I appreciate that. One thing, I guess the way I'd like to start is, I am the only person who sees the world like I do. I'll repeat that. I am the only person who sees the world like I do. The context of this quote comes from Stride Toward Freedom, which was a book that Martin Luther King wrote in response to the clergyman, which we've already heard mentioned, suggesting that he wait, that the civil rights movement was moving too fast, it was demanding too much, and it was becoming too turbulent for the times. But I think that the mirror that Dr. King was holding up is that evil is in the eye of the beholder. And he could see evil. He felt evil deeply, of course, within his own life and the life of his community. And he was trying to help hold that mirror up for those outside his community who were asking him to wait. But what King was pointing out to those clergy, and of course to us even today, is that we're complicit with evil when we don't even recognize it in our own lives. And perhaps that's part of what was underneath the clergy saying, wait, this is moving too quickly, we're uncomfortable, which Eric was just mentioning. When we get uncomfortable, we want to flee, fight, or freeze. And then there's confirmation bias. I'll just invite you to Google that if you're not familiar with confirmation bias. But it's hard to take criticism or consider that we're wrong when we're faced with something that's uncomfortable. But what we have to do is internal work. It's serendipitous, or perhaps the movement of the Holy Spirit, that the psalm appointed for today is Psalm 139, which concludes, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Show me, God, where there is evil in my life, because sometimes I don't even see it and I am doing harm. In the United Methodist Church, we have 3 simple rules that John Wesley gave us. Number 1, do no harm. Number 2, do good. And number 3, stay in love with God. We're doing evil and harm without even knowing it, because we get our tunnel vision and think that everyone sees the world the way that we do. And Dr. King is inviting us to open our eyes to see that there is evil in our personal lives. When we deal with the evil in our personal lives on a day-to-day basis, we can then follow the ripple effect that moves into our families, into our neighborhoods, into our communities, and into the world. Thank you for the opportunity to wrestle with this and to be part of this conversation.
Okay, next we have Reverend Sharon Wright, if you will introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sharon Wright, and I'm the chaplain at Emory and Henry College and one of the pastors at Emory United Methodist Church.
Okay, and Dr. King's quote is, "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?"
So this is a quote from Dr. King that was delivered to an audience in Montgomery in 1957. King believed that strength comes from a community working together, which is why this quote has often been used to organize service efforts during MLK celebrations. And I think service is helpful in that it gives a shared experience and a common goal, which is an open door that can invite us to listen to and to learn from each other, which requires humility, which is a virtue that we seem to be lacking in abundance these days in all sectors of society, including, very sadly, the church. When we are able to be humble, we accept our limitations, our failures, and our brokenness, even as we see the humanness in others. Humility allows us to put others' needs before our own.
Dr. Holloway. Dr. Holloway, you muted.
Okay, so we have the Reverend Dr. Merrill Hawkins. Would you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Hello, I'm Mel Hawkins. I am part-time pastor of Mount Pleasant United Methodist Church in Jefferson County. I'm also a professor of religion at Carson Newman University in Jefferson City. And in the interest of time, since we are running short, let me just say that the quote, and was someone going to read the quote, or shall I do that?
You can go right ahead.
Okay. "The function of education is to teach one to think intensely and to think critically. Intelligence plus character is the goal of true education." It's a magnificent quote. It is a quote that Martin Luther King wrote in an essay when he was a junior at Morehouse, in an editorial that he wrote in the student paper called "The Purpose of Education." It's incredibly timely. It's incredibly timely. It's widely available on the internet, and the additional quotes in that essay say it far better than I could. I'm just going to read one additional quote and let his words say it best. If we're not careful, our colleges will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists consumed with immoral acts. Be careful, brothers and sisters. Be careful, teachers. Intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of a true education. He also says in this essay, mentioned several times, the danger of believing falsehoods, of believing lies that are not factual. And as I was reading that, I could not help but think of the delusions of persons storming our Capitol and believing a lie that the many people who have a formal education that this election was stolen. And education is about transforming character. It's about developing virtue. It's about developing critical thinking. But in addition to teaching people how to think, there is a certain measure in which education does teach people and should teach people what to think. And there are some positions and ideas that are falsehoods, that are untenable, and need to be called out as wrong in our pulpits and in our classrooms.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all. We're moving right along. We just have like 3 more, if you can hang in there, and then we get to hear from if President Wells has still had the time to be on, and then we'll be finished. But you've been ever so gracious. So we now have Reverend Dr. Karen Black with us, and the quote, I'll go ahead and read the quote, and then Dr. Black can introduce herself and then respond to it. The quote is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Reverend Black, would you introduce yourself and comment? No. Maybe she had to go. Then we'll move right along.
No, I didn't go.
Oh,
I was
okay.
muted.
Okay.
My name is Karen Black, and I'm a retired social worker and retired seminary teacher. And now I am a pastor of Bradburn Hills and Mount Pleasant United Methodist Church in Greenville. Referring to Dr. King's beliefs that all communities and states were interrelated. King wrote from the Birmingham jail, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught on an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." And as I was looking at all of this, I said, many people really don't even know what justice is. And so therefore, I looked and studied what justice is. And in a nutshell, to preserve time, it's just that you treat people right. Treat people right, have some integrity, just treat people right. So that quote is very obvious, makes obvious sense, because people just don't understand. People operate in a vacuum. And if someone were to do some of the things that we do to others, will we take the time to think, am I receiving the same kind of injustice that other people had for us? But see, he was not simply talking about justice as far as treating somebody right by not hitting them or stealing from them or telling lies. But what he was talking about was a system with bias. We have a system that is biased in this country. We have the uneven and the unjust. All of us are not perfect, but our system is biased. And the only way that we can begin to change and to provide justice for everyone is for us to look at ourselves in the mirror and then make an internal change. it's very important for us to change in order to bring about justice. And first, Dr. King, when he was talking about this, he dealt with the Eurocentric Americans and said they need to re-educate themselves and re-educate themselves out of a white-centered, white-dominated ideologies. And that he said love and justice are inseparable. Love drives one to do what's right. And these things, they impact us because we get caught up in all kinds of things. And we get caught up into them, and sometimes we end up with totalitarian regimes. So with these totalitarian regimes that we have, like we saw in World War II, it begins to let evil run rampant. Injustice anywhere, leading to people not knowing justice at all, is not a random error. It is because we have systemically had bias, and it is wrapped in all the institutions of this country, in money and justice, as we have all seen, not only with people storming the Capitol on lies, but people blaming things on other folk that are not true. Whenever Black Lives Matters does something, yes, there are some people who do some bad things, but they have never came with shovels, picks, guns, and things of that sort. So injustice was trying to take over justice and take over this country. And King stressed two things: a negative peace, which was the absence of tension, and a positive peace. And that peace was when the justice was present. So the concept of justice was the thing that ran throughout the civil rights movement. However, King said that laws are human made, but justice is divine. And to truly be justice means that we have to have a higher moral law, and that we should ascribe to it and do things that correlate with the power of God. So therefore, power, he says, at its best is implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. It has once been said, in order to find the solution to a problem, you cannot be on the same level consciously as the problem. So Dr. King wants us to look at ourselves, change ourselves, and see, and for us to look at how we treat others.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Reverend Boyd Evans. If you will introduce yourself and read the quote and respond.
Hi, I'm Reverend Boyd Evans from St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Abingdon. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and I've enjoyed all the wonderful remarks of my fellow pastors this afternoon. Now, my quote is, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." And the main place I found this quote was in a sermon that Dr. King gave in 1956. And it was after there was an order that the University of Alabama be integrated or not deny anyone admission due to race. And so soon after that, there was a person enrolled, a Black person enrolled, Arthurian Lucy, enrolled in Auburn. And as soon as she walked on campus, there was protests, there was eggs thrown at her, there were bricks thrown at her, there were just a terrible mob jumped on her car, and I even think there were crosses burned in town, and it was very awful. And so finally, the trustees persuaded this young woman to withdraw from the university. And the next day, the newspaper reported that peace had been restored to Tuscaloosa. Peace had been restored, I guess you might say, but there was no justice. There was no justice for Miss Lucy, certainly not. And so, and there was, probably, depending on who you're asking, certainly there was not peace for Miss Lucy in this situation either, who had to suffer through such abuse. And so, so I think this is a great example. I quoted Dr. King during my sermon today, and we had a banner in front of the church, and I've gotten some little pushback. I've made some of my white congregation a little nervous here lately, and one of my parishioners, as we're walking out, said, "Well, I appreciate what you had to say, but I'm sort of struggling with Black Lives Matter and how there's violence at some of the marches, and how maybe they're anti-police and had brought that up." And I said, well, how long can you peacefully protest and not see anything happen about it, and remain peaceful? That was where I pushed back. How long can you remain peaceful in the midst of such violence? I heard a statistic the other day that there were only 7 days of 2020 that there wasn't a Black person killed at the hands of law enforcement. 7 days. And I think we're people are expected to be to be very orderly, and not just angry about this. But I think that this is where, I think Dr. King was a genius in this area, because he wasn't really a pacifist. He disrupted things, but was never violence. I think of the Montgomery bus boycott when I think of his genius in nonviolent direct action. Dr. King was for direct action. He hit the Montgomery in their pocketbooks by boycotting the buses. So there was action as well. In the time of Jesus, there was the Pax Romana, as we're all familiar with. Probably this was the Roman enforced peace. It was peace at the point of a sword, where you weren't allowed to protest or speak out. And so it was not a real peace. So I'm sure I'm over my time, and I will just say that where there is no justice, there is not true peace. Thank you.
Thank you. We have next Emory Henry's very own Reverend David Jackson. Reverend Jackson.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Holloway. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I've known a lot of you for a long time, and it's nice to be with you in this setting. I'm currently at Emory and Henry and the co-pastor of Emory United Methodist Church. My quote is a well-known one: "The moral arc of the universe bends at the elbow of justice." So I've heard this quote for a long time now, and I'm used to hearing it as the arc of the universe is long but bends toward justice, which is a quote from a speech that Dr. King gave in 1968 at the National Cathedral in our nation's capital, just before his assassination. And you may remember, it was a favorite of President Obama's, who kept it posted in the Oval Office during his 8 years as president. So I want to take 60 seconds to talk about two words here. The first is long, because within this framework, the arc of the moral universe is long. And that's why we continue to experience so much injustice in today's world. Jesus knew this, of course. There will always be wars and rumors of wars, he tells us. Injustice will exist in this fallen world. It's like driving from Virginia to California, and you get to Kansas and you think, man, I've still got a long way to go. The second observation is justice, because justice gives us hope. It reminds us that that one day, someday, God will make God's home among mortals, and that God's perfect justice will reign among us. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Bowers?
Yes, I think Reverend Williams told me that she had to leave. She had to be somewhere else by 4:45. So we will miss the dynamic words from Reverend Williams, and hopefully we'll get those another time. But it's at this time, if our fearless leader, President John Wells, is still. Oh, okay. All right. Reverend Charlotte?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
You want to introduce yourself and your quote and give us some comments?
All right. I am Charlotte Shanellen Nzinga Inyaboki Williams. I'm the senior pastor of Eastdale Village Community United Methodist Church, and I consider myself to be an unapologetically Black woman. The quote that I have is, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at the time of challenge and controversy." And Dr. King was actually wrote this passage or sermon is particularly to white citizens who found themselves in a place of relative comfort during that era. Dr. King urged white citizens to go beyond judging of their character were in times of ease and comfort, and to bring about spotlights upon injustices anywhere. What he was saying is that Dr. King says that only a dry as dust religion prompts a minister to extol the glories of heaven while ignoring the social conditions that cause humankind to go through an earthly hell. In other words, any religion that is not concerned with how God's children are being treated is only a dry as dust religion. Dr. King challenges us that we can't call ourselves people of faith if we lack interest in how people are being treated. And we can't be silent to the suffering and claim that we are following the word of God or that we love one another. Dr. King goes on to say that there comes a time when silence is betrayal. It's easy to say Black Lives Matter, but that's not enough when we're not dealing with the policies. So love is the foundation of all living religion, and it isn't what you say or how you feel or what is an ideal. It is commitment to treat others as ourselves, especially those that are marginalized. So it is in times like this that we have to speak truth to power, because we have become socialized to injustice, but not socialized or challenged to confront it. And so Dr. King is reminding us that we definitely in this moment in time cannot allow the issues to pervade and turn a blind eye, and that we need to remind ourselves that while Jesus' call eventually led him to the crucifixion, it was the act of the state, not his calling, that killed him. And similarly, Dr. King followed a call that put him at the odds with the power structure or the powers that be. It wasn't his calling that killed him, but rather the forces that could not abide through the social change that he and others of the civil rights movement led and embellished.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Williams. I'm glad you were able to stay on with us. It was well worth it. Okay, so I'm hoping that President Wells, the president of Emory and Henry College, is still with us at this time and will reflect and give us our closing remarks. And we will hope to see you all again in another capacity.
Well, thank you so much. And it's been such an honor to have everyone with us today. What a wonderful way to spend the afternoon in contemplation and reflection with one another. We are at Emory and Henry engaged in really an introspection of trying to make some determination about how what we often refer to euphemistically as a difficult history, but it's one with which we must wrestle. And it is one with which we must come to have an understanding that allows us to move ahead as a voice for justice and equality and quality in our region. Well, the quote that I was given was, "History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people." It's one of my very favorite quotes from Dr. King. He used it on a couple of different occasions, and some version of that quote was as early as 1958, and then used in a version with the letter from a Birmingham jail, and then later again in 1966 with James Meredith's Mississippi March Against Fear. But in it, Dr. King is calling us to remember that just as we have heard from so many of the prophetic voices today, we are called to action. We are not called to neutrality. I remember the title of one of my favorite writers, Howard Zinn, who said, "You can't remain neutral on a moving train." And this country is a moving train. Our Emory and Henry College is a moving train, and you can't remain neutral. There has to be a voice that speaks on behalf of justice. But very quickly, I'll take the last 60 seconds to say this. When I was on faculty at Carson Newman 20 years ago with my good friend, Dr. Hawkins, who was on our call today, we had one of our alums, the Reverend Earl Stallings, who was one of the 8 ministers who Dr. King was addressing his letter from a Birmingham jail. He was an alum from Carson Newman and came back to our campus and was reflecting on his time as the pastor at First Baptist Church there in Birmingham. In the letter that Dr. King penned to those 8 so-called moderate pastors, Reverend Stallings was the only one that Dr. King actually identified in a very positive way for having for having made the decision the Sunday prior to allow for an integrated service that included Andrew Young, who would later become mayor of Atlanta and U.S. ambassador to the UN. But Reverend Stallings reflected on this. He said, even as he was being called out and being called to a different understanding in King's letter from a Birmingham jail, and even as white members of his congregation were leaving, it was a reminder that even though we can find a voice for justice, even if we find a voice calling for a kind of compassion and a love and an investment in one another's well-being, we still have to recognize that we are not merely choosing sides between 2 opposing groups of human beings. We are not forsaking the praise of one group in order to gain the praise of the other. Just as Earl Stallings found himself becoming under criticism from both the left and the right and being marginalized by both groups, he said his task that he always remembered for the rest of his life was to keep his eye on the one reward, which was to continue to be focused on justice. The reward for us is not the praise of other human beings. The reward for us is to keep our eyes on justice so that the conscience that God gave us, which is a gift, we have seen people who can be in public service and in positions of power who don't have a conscience. But for those who have been given a conscience by God, it's a gift and it's also a responsibility. And that conscience needs to be aligned with justice, regardless of whether or not we hear the praise or the criticism of our fellow human beings. Our task is an eternal one, and our eyes must be fastened upon eternal truths, which affirm the value and the nobility of recognizing that each and every individual has sacred worth, but also that those who have been marginalized by systems that have denied that worth must specifically be called out so that we can, in fact, live in justice and we can find our voice. Thank you again on behalf of Emory and Henry for everybody being here. And thank you, John Holloway and Sharon Bowers for hosting this wonderful time together. This has been an incredibly wonderful, moving, and stimulating time together.